Hello, my name is John Simaika. I am a senior lecturer in aquatic ecology and conservation, IG Delft, Institute for Water Education. In this video on freshwater indices, you will learn about the different ways in which freshwater ecosystems are assessed for their overall health or integrity, and how this information can support sustainable management of aquatic ecosystems. In this session, we will review the stresses that aquatic ecosystems are under and how ecosystem degradation ultimately leads to a loss of biodiversity and ecosystem function. Without monitoring ecosystems, it is not possible to track how they change. Indicators can be used to monitor the state of aquatic ecosystems as part of assessments. Indicators have specific purposes and key requirements. As we will see, indicators can operate at different geographic scales, from the local right up to the global scale, and are also temporally sensitive. Indicators can be based on organisms, their functions, river hydromorphology, or ecosystem services. The importance of indicators as part of the sustainable management cycle cannot be overstated. The call by national, regional, and global policies for the development of indicators is an important positive development towards the sustainable management of aquatic ecosystems. In the next slide, we start with a global perspective on a major ecosystem stressor, nutrient pollution. In this figure are two global country maps. Both show the risk of major river basins to nutrient pollution from the excessive inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus to surface water. The map at the top is for the years 2000 to 2005. The map at the bottom is a projection of water quality risk from nutrient pollution for the year 2050. Areas that are white have no data. Green means that basins are at low risk of pollution. The yellow color means moderate, and orange and red are for basins with elevated and high risks to water quality. A visual comparison of the two maps shows clearly that risk increases in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Europe. Generally, these are areas that are already at moderate or elevated risk. Most of the low-risk areas appear to remain low risk, a notable exception being the island of Madagascar. In terms of risk to people, this means up to 3 billion people will be at high risk of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution by the year 2050. Next, we will look at environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, also at a global scale. On the left is a conceptual diagram of the threats to freshwater ecosystems. Notice how many of the threats overlap. The author chose to put overexploitation at the center of the diagram because it is the oldest of threats to aquatic ecosystems. Notice also how climate change encompasses all other threats. This is because climate change is a global threat and cannot be managed at the basin scale alone, but requires a global effort that is then acted on at the regional, national, and local scales. On the right side is a bar chart with green and blue bars. The green bars are for terrestrial ecosystems and the blue bars are for freshwater ecosystems. The white dots with the connecting line shows population trend data for vertebrates in the freshwater, marine, and terrestrial realms. The trend has been plotted from the year 1970 until 2016. The index starts at 100 in 1970 and serves as a benchmark against the following years. While a decline can be seen in terrestrial ecosystems, this is much steeper in freshwater ecosystems, as evidenced by the census results from 2014 and 2016. Next, we will briefly discuss monitoring from a historical perspective. This timeline shows that monitoring the condition of aquatic ecosystems is not a recent idea, and that it has developed since the mid-1800s, with early developments happening in Europe and in the United States of America in parallel. People had the idea of monitoring rivers and streams mainly because they were getting sick or saw algal blooms and fish die. Some rivers in heavily industrialized areas were so heavily polluted that they even caught on fire and caused not only environmental damage but also property damage. This led to the development of indicators for use in regular monitoring and part of wider bioassessment protocols. This was often called for by legislation developed due to the awareness that environmental damage has negative social and economic effects. This led to further refinement of indices and their embeddedness in modern policy. Next, we will look at how monitoring fits into environmental management. Environmental management plans have 4 stages. The first stage starts with a plan that has defined objectives and targets and addresses policy and legal requirements. The second stage, the do stage, is where the plan is implemented. The third stage checks on the quality of the implementation. Monitoring is a key component of this stage. In the case of low quality results, corrective actions need to be taken. In the fourth stage, the environmental plan is reviewed and improved. The cycle can be repeated as needed. Let's look at some planning that needs to be done in order to start monitoring in the next slide. Monitoring is a complex process and needs to be planned through thoroughly and done at the right time, in the right place, with the right method. Here we discuss 4 of the major considerations. Clear objectives need to be set in order to know what to monitor for. Are introduced species invading a river or stream? Is nutrient pollution affecting water quality? Are fish populations declining? Each problem has its own unique set of indicators. An indicator that tracks the progress of an invasion will not help with monitoring and responding to water quality issues, even if the 2 problems may be related, in that lower water quality may facilitate the invader to take hold in a new system. The methods used to monitor, therefore, need to be tailored to the problem. The timescale at which monitoring happens also needs to be considered. For example, restoration projects are often monitored and evaluated only 1 or 2 years after implementation. Yet, in most cases, notable recoveries by way of biota returning to the restored habitats or functions being restored only happens many years or even decades later. Finally, monitoring needs to be cost-effective. It is not always possible to visit sites and measure environmental parameters. In that case, remote sensing can be quite helpful. In places where monitoring needs to be at the site level, a monitoring network is established so that the number of monitoring stations is kept at a minimum while ensuring enough information is obtained from monitoring. Freshwater indicators are complex tools. They are often misused or misapplied, or the results are misinterpreted. Before applying an indicator, you must consider whether the indicator is relevant to the system studied. Different ecosystems come with their own unique sets of indicators tailored to them. Is the indicator objective? Is it transparent? It must be clear how an indicator is calculated, and the interpretation guidelines must be straightforward and objective. Data availability is a major constraint in biomonitoring. The data collected using the indicator must be characterized by sound collection methods. Appropriate data management systems to protect its integrity and quality assurance processes. Okay. The development of indicators requires, in particular, sufficient stakeholder engagement and suitable and accurate data. A common failing of indicators is the lack of stakeholder engagement. Indicators that are fit for purpose in development must address the needs of varying stakeholders. As an example, stakeholders may be governmental or non-governmental organizations, industry, scientists, community members, or funders. Effective indicators are built on accurate and suitable data. If data are of poor quality or are too coarse to be meaningful or collected at the wrong spatial or temporal scale, they will not be helpful for the development of an indicator or lead to an indicator that does not work as expected. Indicators should be complementary rather than duplicate work that is already done. This ensures that the information gathered adds to the body of knowledge rather than duplicating it. Indicators should be easy to use and easy to understand. If the purpose of an indicator is not clear, end users may not understand what the indicator should be used for. In order for an indicator to be implemented, clear guidelines must be available to the end user on what it is measuring, what the purpose of its use is, and how it should be applied. Indicators are also limited by the spatial and temporal scales at which they can reliably operate. Some indicators are designed for large-scale use, others for small-scale. Large-scale indicators can be good for general messaging and for wide application across different areas with broad-scale global type comparisons. To achieve global relevance, indicators must be sufficiently generic that they can be applied everywhere. In this case, they may rely on coarse data and have limited interpretive value at smaller spatial scales. Small-scale indicators may be much more specific and draw on much finer resolution data, making them more accurate. However, the availability of required data at fine resolution might not be the same everywhere, meaning they cannot be similarly applied and compared from one place to another. Or they may be designed for a specific system and will have to be adapted for use in another system. Similar issues apply to the use of temporal data. Course-level data are useful in indication over long time periods. Fine-level temporal data are useful in indication over short time periods. Indices provide a quantitative baseline from which the status of freshwater ecosystems can be assessed, and changes monitored over time or progress monitored towards a goal. Index development is part of and facilitates integrated water resources management. For example, the development of a freshwater index as a start requires identifying basic data needs and gaps. Indices can also be useful in identifying areas that should be prioritized for investment, where they have identified deficiencies or increased water-related risks that can be mitigated by investing in appropriate changes. Indices are a valuable public awareness tool. This is because they are essentially bits of summarized data and information that communicates a clear message. The use of indicators for communicating information is also a way to effectively bridge science and policy. As might be expected, there's an enormous variety of indicators out there, all fit for different purposes and based on different types of data. Some indicators can fit several categories. For example, the wetland index the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short, are a collection of 17 interlinked global goals designed to achieve a more sustainable future by the year 2030. Each goal has several targets, and in total there are 169 targets. There are several explicitly freshwater-related goals, and many targets are thematically cross-cutting. You might be wondering how progress towards these goals and targets is monitored. This is of course done using indicators, 231 unique indicators in all. You will hear more about the SDGs later in the course, especially in relation to water management and governance. For now, we will focus on SDG 15, Life on Land. Let's have a closer look at SDG 15. The goal is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Target 15.1 states that by 2020, ensure the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of terrestrial and inland freshwater ecosystems and their services, in particular forests, wetlands, mountains, and drylands, in line with obligations under international agreements. The indicator is the proportion of important sites for terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity that are covered by protected areas by ecosystem type. The Red List Index has been developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which also maintains the IUCN Red List of threatened species. The Red List measures extinction risk and provides information and analyses on the world species, such as on their population status, trends, and threats. The Red List Index is a statistic that shows trends in overall extinction risk for species. In the case of indicator 15.1.2, protected area coverage can be combined with the Red List Index to generate indicators of the impacts of protected areas in reducing biodiversity loss. The Red List Index has been widely adopted in different policy contexts, including for assessing progress towards the Convention on Biological Diversity's 2010 target and IG biodiversity targets. It is also recommended as an indicator for the goals and targets in the CBD's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So let's summarize this lecture. There are 4 takeaway messages here. The first is that given the threats and changes that freshwater ecosystems face, there is a clear need for these ecosystems to be monitored. Monitoring is an essential component of sustainable management and use. Secondly, we have learned that indicators are monitoring tools and they have specific applications. Thus, clear objectives need to be set in order to decide what and how to monitor. Thirdly, indicators themselves have specific requirements from the development stage to the implementation stage. Effective indicators are developed with stakeholder input and suitable data and are applied to the right scale, right time, and for the purpose they were designed for. The fourth point is that the need for monitoring and specific indicators are either already or becoming increasingly key components of policies at national, regional, and global scales aimed at protecting natural resources and ecosystem services they provide.